Hello and welcome to Modern World History O Levels, Section B. Today's topic would be the Treaty of Versailles, where we have four subtopics, which are the following: aims of the Big Three, 6 terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the German reaction to the treaty, and the Allied reaction. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 at the Palace of Versailles in Paris at the end of World War I, codified peace terms between the Entente, which were the Allies, comprising of countries like Britain and France, versus the Central Powers and mainly Germany. The Treaty of Versailles held Germany responsible for starting the war and imposed harsh penalties on it. It was largely significant because it directly had the involvement of the Big Three. And who were these Big Three? Let's see. The Big Three refer to the UK, France, and the United States and their leaders, which were directly involved in the formation of Treaty of Versailles. And this is important because the treaties with the remainder of the Central Powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, were made by officials, not world leaders. George Clemenceau was the president of France and had to see his country through World War I. He was the extremist of the three leaders and was hell-bent on revenge against Germany for his nation. Not long ago that France had to face a war against Germany in which it lost its most precious border region of Alsace-Lorraine, but he saw how Germany was not hesitant to attack France again. Therefore, he wished for a Germany that would never be able to pose any threat. Clemenceau wanted a harsh peace. He wanted to ruin Germany economically and militarily so that Germany could never threaten French frontiers again. Not only did France see the majority of the war, but since 1814, France had been attacked and lost 5 times against Germany. And this time, Clemenceau wanted to make sure that peace would be permanent. Clemenceau wanted a harsh punishment for Germany, and he blamed Germany for the starting of the war, since he believed that Austria-Hungary would not have gone so far as to declare war on Serbia if it weren't for their German allies. He was angry, wanted revenge, and he felt threatened by Germany. Therefore, he wanted the independence of the Rhineland and to get Alsace-Lorraine back from Germany, therefore stripping Germany from its most protected border encampments and all of its industry regions. George Clemenceau also wanted Germany to pay for all the damage of the war, including civilian and military losses, therefore crippling the German economy. Moreover, his truest wish was to dissolve Germany entirely and back into city-states. Clemenceau believed if Germany did not exist, the world and ultimately France would be free from tyranny at last. Next we have Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was the realist of the three, realized how a bad peace treaty here could result in disastrous ends later on. Lloyd George wanted Germany to pay. He was in favor of a less severe settlement, enabling Germany to recover quickly so that Germany could resume its role as a major British client. Lloyd George wanted to protect the British Empire, and the main way he thought of doing so was to increase trade and capital. He also realized that he needed a functioning, flourishing Germany if he ever wanted the UK to get reparations from Germany for the destruction it caused. In the end, Lloyd George wanted a peace which would be final in its nature and didn't create anger in Germany, which may lead up to another war in the future, which unfortunately we know it did. The final member of the Big Three was Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States of America. He was an idealist by nature, as USA, being so far off across the Atlantic Ocean, had experienced virtually none of the war and joined only in the last few months of World War I and experienced all the glory but none of the carnage. The USA also had a large German immigrant population, so anything extremely cruel against Germany would be largely unfavorable as most of its population had German heritage. Woodrow Wilson wanted a linear peace. However, he had to accept British and French demands for reparations and compensation. He was able to limit the reparations to include mainly civilians and property damages rather than the whole combined Allied war effort. In the end, Wilson was in favor of self-determination, the idea that people should be freed from foreign rule and given democratic governments of their own choice. In order to do so, he also wanted to form a League of Nations where every country and every people would be able to meet, be equal, have a noticeable impact on the global stage. The treaty these three formed had six main terms, which are the following. First of all, Germany lost land in Europe. The German Empire, being an empire, acquired most of its border regions from other nations. The Treaty of Versailles sought to correct this. This was the original German Empire which Germany had acquired and expanded in during the war after 1914. In the territories that Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Saar region, which was the main coal and industrial center of Germany, to France for 15 years as a part of their reparations, which crippled Germany economically and industrially. Moreover, Germany lost the Malmedy to Belgium, North Schleswig to Denmark, West Prussia and Upper Silesia to Poland, and Danzig was made a free city. The last two were especially important, as these were regions from the old Prussian Empire, which made the German Empire and was the heart of the German Empire. To take away land from the center of and just outside of Berlin was a truly devastating blow. The Eastern European lands that Germany had just taken from Russia, the Russian Empire, were liberated and made it into their own countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These were some of the examples of self-determination that Woodrow Wilson wanted being practiced out. Unfortunately, that was not always the case. Moreover, Austria, after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a largely German nation, was barred from making a union with Germany, essentially splitting apart the German people, which in this case was directly against the policy of self-determination. Because what would have become a majority German country was being fractured, and German people were forcefully being made the minority in other foreign nations. Here is the list. As we can see, Danzig was a major German city in West Prussia, which was made a free city, which means it was made an international territory where anyone could go, essentially under the direct administration of the League of Nations, which was mainly spearheaded by Britain and France. Therefore, it was mainly an excuse of Britain and France of monitoring Germany up close. Moreover, Germany lost all of its colonies in Africa and the Pacific as well. Though they were essentially declared mandates, it was very clear that it was just a land grabbing mechanism for Britain and France. The German army was reduced and restricted to up to only 100,000 men and access to no submarines, no airplanes, and only 6 battleships. The once strongest army in the world was essentially now made one of the weakest. And though in name Germany had an army, it would be effectively useless and just in name. Moreover, Germany was also forced to accept complete responsibility for World War I, all of the damages, all of the debts, and for every consequence that would come after. Furthermore, Germany was to pay reparations to the Allies for making them go to war. The total amount that Germany owed the Allies for this was 6.6 million pounds in installments until 1984. Such figures were unheard of, and this was essentially a death sentence to the German economy because the installments were owed effective immediately. Everyone knew no country on earth at that time had the capacity or the ability to come up with that ridiculous amount of figures in such little notice after such a devastating fight. Lastly, the sixth and final term of the Treaty of Versailles made and formed the League of Nations. It essentially authorized and validated the formation of the League of Nations, which was essentially an international parliament with representatives from every nation, which would together decide on global and foreign policy, except for the nation which probably would be affected and impacted most by this. Germany was banned and barred from making any decision or appearing in the League of Nations till 1926. So being forced upon this treaty, what was the German reaction to it? First and foremost, that it was a dictated peace. The Germans were not allowed in the discussions at Versailles. They were simply presented with the terms and forced to sign. Many historians believe that if the Germans were allowed in the discussions, some of the harsh terms of the treaty could have been toned down, and excuses couldn't have been made by people like Hitler, who blamed the economic turmoil of Germany on conditions such as these. Germans also objected to being saddled with the entire blame for the outbreak of war. It should be noted that the war mainly broke out because Austria-Hungary and Serbia had disputes over the legitimacy of the other. Soon after, big allies such as France, Russia, and Germany were called in, and to ensure Belgian neutrality in the war, so was the UK. And to protect the UK, the US, and essentially all of Europe and the world, including Japan, were roped in. Furthermore, it would have been impossible to have reached at the conclusion that Germany did indeed cause the war in just 6 weeks, which is what the Special Commission on War Responsibility responsibility did. It was evident that the Allies wanted reparations from the war, and neither of the and none of the remainder of the Central Powers were in any condition, present or future, in order to provide them, except for Germany. Austria-Hungary was to be dissolved. The Ottoman Empire was already called the sick man of Europe. Bulgaria was insignificant compared to the whole war effort. Germany was the industrial, the educational, and the finance hub of Europe and the world. The Allies knew it, and they wanted to exploit it. Moreover, the Germans were against the loss of land, but mainly the Germans living in those lands were the minority, and those claims were on nationalistic, ethnic grounds. Germans did have a legitimate claim of resentment on the reduction of armaments. Suddenly, Germany was surrounded by new and hostile nations, especially France, with a total of just 100,000 troops, which weren't enough to keep law and order in the country, lest protect its borders. So it was understandable why the French would want a weak Germany. The German unrest became even more apparent when none of the other global powers wanted to disarm after the war, which was usually the norm. France also had something to say that the Treaty of Versailles was against the policy of self-determination that the American President Woodrow Wilson so wanted to be enacted. However, these claims are not legitimate as the point of self-determination was never made into the Treaty of Versailles, and the Germans outright denied any such peace offerings with the self-determination clause back in January 1918, when it did still seem that the Germans might just win. The main blow to the German pride was the Clause of Reparations. The amount of 6,600 million pounds was ridiculous at any time. The figure was so high that the Germans began to default on their installment payments, which angered the Allies, who were essentially relying on the German economy to bankroll theirs, since their economy had also been devastated by the war effort. And countries like UK and France wanted to get rid of their debts from the United States as quickly as possible. Eventually, the Allies did realize their mistake and reduced the reparations to 200 million pounds, but that was done so 11 years later, after economic recovery and after the effects of the full front of the war had worn down. The default in payments did also at one point cause France and Belgium to invade Germany and occupy the industrious region of the Rhineland, which made Germany default on payments even more, since their industry was not even functioning at that time. All in all, the Germans clearly did have some grounds for complaints, but it is worth pointing out that the treaty could have been even more harsh. If Clemenceau, the president of France, had had his way, the Rhineland would have become an independent state, the France would have annexed the Saar, and the rest of the German provinces would have dissolved into city-states.